Let's move on to the part of the course where I will show you what Git is, what a repository is, and how to work with Git. Later we will move on to the theory, and then I will try to explain even better what am I going to show you in a moment. You can see on my screen I have a Git bash on my left side, a Windows PowerShell in my bottom right corner, and in my top right corner you can see I have a folder opened. It's actually on my desktop. It's a project folder where I have courses folder, where I have a Git folder. It's the same folder as I used to have in my previous video. You can also see the CLI folder inside of it. But now I also created a couple new folders where you can see a book folder, example folder, and a project folder. Now we want to do a simple project using Git, which we are going to do in this project folder. So what I want to do now is to go to git bash, enter cd command, space, and then drag this folder to my git bash and hit enter. Now I can type pwd to see if I'm actually here. We can see this is our folder now, which we are in. And I want to do the same in PowerShell. cd, and then drag the folder to the PowerShell, press enter, and you can see we are in the same folder as well. Let's type ls to see if our folder is empty. You can see there's no effect for that command now, so that means that our project folder is probably empty. But let's check it in our file explorer. I just opened the project folder and you can see this folder is empty. So we will work in this folder making our first repository. So this is the time we create our first repository in Git. It doesn't matter which command line we are typing in. I will switch between git bash and PowerShell so that you can know it can be done in any command line. So to initialize your Git repository in a command line, let's go to git bash. All you have to do is type git init. We don't need to enter the path to the folder here. If we will just place git init, we will create a repository in the folder we are in. So let's hit enter. And now we have our first repository created. You can see it in the git bash right here. And also you can see it in the file explorer exactly right here. This folder was previously empty, but now we have a folder with our Git repository in it. This folder is hidden by default, so if you want to see it, you have to go to View in your File Explorer and then check this option right here, Hidden Items. Because if it's unchecked, you won't be able to see this folder. But if you go to View and check Hidden Items, you can see this folder is actually in our folder. This folder is by default hidden, because this way it's harder to delete it by accident. And that's our repository. Everything beyond this folder is our workspace. Our workspace is empty at the moment, but we will create some files soon. And even if we would delete these files in our workspace, if we would add them to the repository earlier, we can easily recover them. Now let's see how this Git folder looks inside. Let's open it. As you can see, we have various folders here, but we are not going into them. That's not necessary to work with Git at this stage. All you need to know for now is that all important data and information about our Git repository are stored in these folders. So let's go back now. And let's create a new file. For example, text document. Let's call it file.txt. Now let's type ls in our git bash to see if it's there. And we can see it. The file has been created. Now you could say that nothing important is going on with our Git at the moment, but that's actually not true. And to check it out, all you need to do is to type git status, press enter. Oh, I made a typo. Once again, git status, enter. And now you can clearly see that git status command informs us about what Git knows about our project. And here we can see that Git knows that we created a file and this file is untracked. So you can obviously see that at this stage we are already working with Git. Let's clear our console now. And before we actually start working with Git, I would like to configure it first. At some point of our work, Git would force us to configure it, so it's best to do it right away. And to do that, we need to define some parameters. Let's go to our Git bash once again. Let's type git config global, and these will be our global settings for all our future repositories. Of course, later you will be able to change this data for a specific repository if it will be necessary. But for now, we will just enter our global configuration. So now what we want to change is our username. That should be your name, and that should be the first thing we need to configure. It's good to place your first name and your last name here, but I'll place my first name and my nickname. Like this. And let's hit enter. The second thing we need to set is our email. Now I will just press arrow up to go to my previously used command. And the next thing we want to configure is user email. And that's going to be the peatson@gmail.com. Let's hit enter. And now when I'll press the arrow up on my keyboard and enter this command without specifying the email, I'll get the actual email set in the global settings. So let's check it out. Let's hit enter. And you can clearly see that my set email is thepeatson@gmail.com. It's the same situation if we now type username and hit enter, and you can see it's Damian. Now I want to show you where you can find the code editor settings we indicated when installing Git. Let's go back to our Git bash and let's type git config global core editor. Let's hit enter, and here you can see this is our path to the Visual Studio Code on my computer. Let's clear our console, and now I want to show you that the configuration file of Git is placed in our default command line folder. So let's go to our Git bash, and as you may remember, if we place cd and tilde, we will go back to our default folder. You can place pwd to see it. That's our default folder, as you may remember it. And the Git configuration file is also hidden, but we can view it, for example, by typing notepad.git config and hitting enter. And voila. This is the file with our configuration of Git, where we can see all our data saved. Remember that you have to be in the default folder to access this file this way. Now let's clear our console. And the other way to view the content of this configuration file in our command line is to enter something else. And that would be cat git config. Let's hit enter. And you can see the content of the same file not opened in the notepad, but viewed in our command line. Since we are in the same folder as the file we want to open, all we need to do is to place the name and the extension of the file we want to open. But we can also open this file being in a whole different folder. In that case, we need to type the whole path to this file after the cat command or after the notepad command. If we want to put some other data to some repository, all we need to do is to remove the global attribute. For example, if we want to use another email on some repository, all we need to do is to delete this attribute and use this command, git config user email, or username if we want to. This way the global settings will not change, but for this particular project, different data will be kept. And this data will be kept in our Git folder this way. If you save some data for a particular Git repository, which is not global, then you can go to the Git folder and you can see the config file where these particular data will be stored. This data is important so that you know who and when made certain changes to the project and how to contact them. Now let's go back in our folder. Let's go back to our git bash. Let's delete this command because we don't need it. And by entering a certain command again, you can overwrite the data of the email or a name. But if you want to delete them without overwriting them with other data, you can do it like this. Git config global unset user email. Let's hit enter. Now let's check our email by typing the command git config global user email, and we can see it's empty. So now we can set it once again. Hit enter. And let's check it once again. And now we can see it's already there. Once again. Let's clear our console. The first thing we did in this video was making a Git repository with git init command. But it's not necessarily the first thing you need to do when starting a new project. Let me show this to you in another example. Let's go back in our Explorer. Let's go to a different folder, the example folder. Let's switch our PowerShell and Git Bash. Just like this. Now let's type cd in PowerShell and drag our example folder to our PowerShell. Let's hit enter. And now we are in our example folder. Now I will open this folder in our File Explorer as well, just so you can see what's going on in this folder. As you can see, it's empty at the moment. So let's create a new file. And we'll create a new file before initializing Git repository. So let's do this with the echo command, with the content example of the file.txt. Let's hit enter. You can see in our File Explorer it was created. And we can view its content in our PowerShell by typing cat file.txt like this, and you can see it's working fine. And now, having a file or even many files in our workspace, we can initialize a Git repository. So what we want to do is to place git init, press enter, and you can see in our PowerShell and in our File Explorer, our Git repository has been created. So now let's check our Git status. Let's press enter. And this is the effect we will get. We will talk about everything later on, but even now you can see that we work on branch master, which you can see right here. We have no commits yet, and we have one untracked file, which is our file txt, which was created before we initialized our Git repository. You can even see a suggestion of what you can do now if you want this file to be tracked by Git. You can see this suggestion right here. But we will talk about everything in this course, and everything will be very clear for you very soon. But now let's work with Git on a bigger project, using commits and adding files to the stage area. Let's see how the history of our repository will look like. Let's go.